Greetings, friends of liberty. When I look at the strength of England, one of the greatest pillars of our national vitality, is the simple reality that our landowning and merchant classes, the peerage and gentry, have historically posed a powerful counterpoint to the monarchy. Their strength, as expressed politically in the House of Lords and Commons, has, as much as anything, provided the assurance that no sovereign can run roughshod over our ancient rights and liberties. Given the security of our property, our aristocracy have used their estates both in a more politically effective and commercially minded way, becoming richer and their estates larger as a result than the landed aristocracy and merchants of other nations, all of which provides a very solid bulwark against monarchical tyranny. However, if we take a sidelong glance at other countries, such as Russia, we can quickly understand why 'tis such a political basket case. First, Russian nobles could be dispossessed by the Tsars of their property, and often were, simply at his command if he did not follow their orders in joining the army or civil bureaucracy as he liked. Ivan the Terrible, for instance, was notable for the gratuitous violence that he visited upon the aristocratic families that did not obey his every whim. Secondly, Russian landowners also had their land holdings scattered throughout different regions of the country, as opposed to we English landowners, who have consolidated our property into much larger estates through the years. And thirdly, the Russian middle class, for a long time, was virtually non-existent. Again, very much in distinction to England. And fourthly, 'tis not surprising, thus, that the poor Russian landowners, tired of it all, often chose even not to speak Russian, but instead French. Au diable tout ça! And speaking of the French, if we survey the French state and its aristocracy, to a lesser degree we find the same kettle of fish, not quite as rank, but still quite odoriferous. In France, too, French political power being concentrated to such a degree in Mr. L'État c'est moi, the French nobles could only rarely participate in the convening of their own parliaments, the French kings trying to rule all on their own, virtually dismissing their nobles from political life. Of course, very unlike in England, where the Lords and Commons could exercise a decisive opposition to the king. The French monarch simply appointed his own ministers and ruled as he wished. And so, seeing the many differences that characterize the French and especially Russian state compared to the English in this, our 18th century and beyond, into your own 20th and 21st centuries, we find today historian Richard Pipes's comprehensive, classically liberal account showing the unfortunate continuity of the Russian people's entire political and economic history, from their origins around the Carpathian Mountains all the way to the start of the Russian Revolution. In Russia, under the old regime, Pipes hypnotizes with his superlative prose, knowledge of Russian, English, Polish, and German, and an all-encompassing mastery of both the minutiae and broad sweep of Russian history. Given that this book is infused with hundreds of insights, arguments, and facts, let me pare my review down to the essentials so we can, without becoming overwhelmed, get a taste of the most important historical principles and forces influencing Russian history. Number one, Russia's geography and climate.
Geographically, there is A, the tundra, B, the huge forest, the taiga, the largest in the world, greater than the Amazon rainforest, which up until the 17th century constituted perhaps Russia's greatest source of income from all the fur-bearing animals trapped there. And 3, the grasslands of the steppe. Russia, with Canada, is the most northern country in the world and more frigid in the east. Rain, oddly, falls unfortunately not in the beginning of the growing season, but most copiously in the 2 months of late summer. Given the late arrival of spring, the farming season only lasts from 4 to 6 months, meaning livestock is habitually weakened by having to endure a long, harsh winter, affecting the raising of both beef and dairy cattle. Also, the shortened season led to more collective farm work in groups of up to 60 instead of as individual farmers, given that they all had to work together to plant their seeds or bring the harvest in as quickly as possible. Agriculture thus developed more slowly than in England and France, which by the 19th century were achieving seed to harvest ratios of 10 to 1, with Russia still stuck at 3 to 1. Besides the climate, another obstructive factor was the lack of urban markets. To motivate the farmers to have an outlet for and to use new techniques to, produce surplus grain and produce. But unfortunately, when some towns like Novgorod became part of the historical and successful Hanseatic Trading League in the Middle Ages and were beginning to create regional prosperity, Moscow under Ivan III and IV, Ivan the Great and Terrible respectively, ironically took offense and by the 16th century had destroyed the city. And so we see yet again the brutal predatory nature of Russian political leaders. Number 2, within Russia, even as early as the Viking period, in their demanding a tribute from conquered populations, we see politically what is called the rise of the patrimonial state, a state which doesn't recognize the property rights of its subjects. This was in marked contrast to where the Normans treated conquered England in giving land to their supporters and thus creating a landed aristocracy. As Pipe says, Russian politics derives from the identification of sovereignty and ownership. Not surprisingly as well, slavery and the trade in slaves lasted much longer in Russia than in Europe. In addition, the existence of the patrimonial state prevented the normal stages of European feudalism, vassalage, political decentralization, and contingent land tenure from occurring normally in Russia. Number 3, the Mongols. Just as decisive an influence as Russia's brutal climate and geography was the invasion of the Mongols. As Pipe says, the appearance in the winter of 1236-7 of Mongol horsemen caused a shock that has never been quite erased from the collective consciousness of the Russian people. The main Khan leading the invasion of Russia was Genghis's grandson, Batu Khan, who had been granted as an inheritance all territories lying in the direction of the setting sun by his grandfather. That's a nice inheritance. The Mongols, led by Batu and heading westward into the setting sun, devastated most Russian cities and, just like the Vikings earlier, were mainly interested in getting an annual tribute from conquered regions, but not in occupying them per se, given that these inhospitable areas posed little military threat to Mongol dominance. The overall effect on Russian life was a severe brutalization of cultural and political life. Number 4, the first prince from whom Russian national rule eventually emerged was Alexander Nevsky and his heirs, like Ivan the Terrible, who accommodated themselves to Mongol demands. They too, like the Mongols, brutally punishing any resistance. Acting just as arrogantly as the Mongols ever had, they scorned those European rulers who shared power with their subjects. Ivan IV, for example, wrote to Queen Elizabeth, "We thought that you lorded it over your domain and ruled by yourself. It is for these reasons that we wanted to engage with you. But now we see that there are men who rule beside you, and not only men, but trading boors who concern themselves with their own merchant profit." This again was the retrograde patrimonial Mongolian attitude that exemplified Russian rulers who annexed more and more of the country and deprived the local aristocracy, the boyars, of their power either by killing them or making them move to other regions. They also enriched themselves by monopolizing the trading in most profitable goods, thus preventing the emergence of a productive middle class. Accumulating more and more territory, by the middle of the 17th century, the Tsars ruled over the largest state in the world, and they eventually succeeded in transforming Russia into a gigantic royal domain. The system of management, which had once prevailed on their private properties, was gradually imposed on the rest of the country until it came to embrace the whole empire. Number 5. What started to change the efficiency, if not the nature and morality, of the patrimonial Russian state? The effect of encountering more advanced European nations from the 18th century onwards. This made Russians gradually realize how backwards they and their society was. Partly, this backwardness was experienced militarily. The Russian army, led by aristocrats who reassembled every spring, their infantry a mob of peasants, failed miserably when first encountering the armies of the modern Swedes, Poles, and Turks. But once the Russian state was modernized bureaucratically, so that it could collect more taxes and thus fund a bigger and more modern army, that army outclassed its former opponents and then added parts of Poland, Finland, and portions of the Black Sea coast and Crimea, and gave all the serfs they found in those areas to Russian aristocrats who colonized them. Similarly, Peter the Great modernized Russia by trying to make the Russian civil service a pure meritocracy, arranging for all aristocrats to start by working their way up from the very bottom. He also started compulsory schooling to create a cadre of technicians for the civil service and military. And he and other czars expanded the police state by, number 1, punishing those who failed to inform on others, even by executing them and their families. 2, punishing hypothetical crimes, the same as actual attempted crimes. And 3, by levying fixed taxes on a whole community and not individuals, which meant that if one person evaded taxes, the others had to pay more, which incentivized their informing on the evader. The effect of all these police state measures was that society could neither develop any sense of common cause nor undertake joint resistance against authority. Russia remained backward also in having little actual currency, and so little banking, with their businessmen having little knowledge of accounting. When Russian industrial production did start to expand in the 1890s, this was largely because of the great investment of foreign capital and because those industries received tariff protection. Number 6, the serf. Pipes argues his condition was in some ways better, but in some ways worse than the very poorest farmers of European countries. It was better in that he was A, allowed by custom, if not law, to own property. B, worked under the direction of his elders. C, had his own house. D, owned what he produced. E, could not be moved from the land against his will. And F, often rented his land from his landlord. On the other hand, his condition was worse than the poorest European farmers in that A, the landlords often raped serf women. B, the serf was not allowed to farm or use virgin land. C, he had few rights, so his life was determined by the arbitrary decisions of his landlord. And D, he had no legal redress from bad treatment by his landlord. Once emancipation came in 1861, the serf was freed from his landlord's arbitrary control and could now sue in court, legally own property, marry freely, and vote in local elections. He still, however, had to appeal to his commune to leave it, could be, as punishment, ordered to be beaten for certain crimes, and still owed the so-called soul tax to the state, unlike other citizens. Pipes argues that 40 years after emancipation in 1901, the serf's position had actually worsened because by law he had been required to pay for the land which had been taken from the landlord and given to him. This brought increasing debt. In addition, it was difficult for individual farmers to separate their land from that of the commune, which damaged the emergence of private individual farming in Russia. In addition, the huge increase in the population of Russia at this time from about 70 million to 125 million also meant increasing economic hardship for some peasants. Number 7, the Russian Orthodox Church. Christianity came of all the European countries to Russia last. As Pipes says, the Slavic population at large was converted slowly and often under duress. For many centuries afterwards, it continued to adhere to pagan practices. The Orthodox Church was first based in Kiev, but then moved to Moscow, where it enjoyed a privileged, tax-free status under Mongol rule. The privilege was an immense boon to the church at a time when the rest of Russia suffered from heavy exactions and violence, and its wealth grew by leaps and bounds. The main beneficiaries of Mongol favor were the monasteries. And once the Byzantine Empire to the south had collapsed, there was no other choice of secular state protector anyway than Russia. As a result of all these historical privileges, the Russian Orthodox Church became a huge land and serf owner, owning by some estimates 1/3 of all Russian land and 1/3 of all serfs. As pertains to its dogma and theology, Pipes notes, the more Eastern Orthodoxy came under the assault of Catholicism and Islam, the more withdrawn and intolerant it grew. Unlike other Western religions, it advocated more of a withdrawal from an impure world and psychological resignation in the face of earthly troubles. You could see this attitudinal difference clearly displayed in the difficulty the Soviets had in Catholic Eastern Europe, as opposed to the easy accommodation offered by the Russian Orthodox Church, none of whose patriarchs ever opposed the Soviet regime, unlike, for example, Pope John Paul II. This habit and doctrine of accommodation to Soviet evil even had a specific name, Sergianism, after Patriarch Sergius Stragorodsky. The church's clergy was famous, like Russians in general, for its ignorance and illiteracy, the clergy knowing little of the Gospels or Bible teachings. Sometimes during services, 2 priests would chant different parts of the liturgy so that they could finish quicker. The church was afflicted by numerous heresies of more sincere believers. One was called the Judaizer movement, which chastised the church for its great wealth and materialism. It found numerous supporters in the Tsarist family. Another reform movement, started by the reclusive monk Nil Sorsky, also advocated that the church give up its wealth and live off of alms. Other sects were called the Old Believers, who rejected certain reforms, and the sectarians, who were similar to Protestants. The church, in order to bow down to the Tsar, also developed and promulgated the doctrine that he was a divine ruler worthy of complete obedience. As Pipes says, by throwing its weight so fully behind royal absolutism, the Russian church achieved its immediate objectives. It uprooted dangerous heresies and saved its properties. But it bought these victories at a terrible price, because many of its monasteries were confiscated and wealth stolen in the end anyway. The church became so obedient to Russian autocracy that some of its higher clergy swore the following oath. I swear by Almighty God that I resolve and am in duty bound to be a faithful, good, and obedient slave and subject to my natural and true Tsar and sovereign. Finally, number 8, the intellectuals or intelligentsia. For their part, encouraged by for example, Catherine the Great's enlightened despotism, they started to develop as a part of civil society. In the late 18th century, they discussed Enlightenment political ideas and the application of the American Constitution to Russia. Then, in the first half of the 19th century, they turned to the German idealism of Kant and Hegel, and in the second half of the 19th century, some developed the Slavophile school of Russian thought, which rejected Western rationalism and championed the collectivism of the commune and simplicity of rural life. A professional class also started emerging. From 1860 and 1900, the number of professionally trained persons in Russia growing from 20,000 to 85,000. From all these elements, political dissidents, radicals, nihilists, and anarchists also began to be drawn, who, however, were sorely disappointed in their complete inability to persuade the peasants to radicalize and start a revolution. The government, for its part, responded to the increased number of revolutionaries in their attempts to assassinate government officials by censorship and slowly increasing the size of the police forces. Since juries would sometimes acquit radicals who obviously tried to murder government officials, the government in turn tried to dispose of these cases by administrative procedures, usually either by military courts or in secret. Correspondingly, the police arm of the state grew bigger and more capable, and on their side, the radicals became more and more extreme. The result was that between 1878 and 1881, the legal and institutional bases were laid for a bureaucratic police regime with totalitarian overtones that have not been dismantled since. In effect, the Russian government created two police forces, one to protect their officials and the second to protect the citizens. Not surprisingly, when the Soviets came to power, they just copied the police procedures of the Tsarist state and continued and intensified the imperial repression. So that concludes our coverage of Pipes' extraordinarily well-written and informative classically liberal history. I can't imagine a better, more informed treatment or more engaging prose style, and so would give this an A+. Proud for my part that we English have been able to develop our political institutions in a way almost diametrically opposed to that of the predatory and incompetent Russian state. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.